They're shown on the left-hand side. In total, we estimate our collective assets to have a replacement value of approximately $3.5 to $4 billion. Breaking this down, about half of our asset value, or around $1.8 billion, is comprised of transportation and building assets, and they're shown as the two blue areas of the pie chart. Just over 40% of our asset values, or around $1.6 billion, is comprised of our three major utility groups, and those are water, drainage, and the sanitary systems. That's shown in yellow, red, and green. And then the remaining 8% of our asset values are comprised of assets across our park system, vehicles and equipment, wharves, technology, golf, and library. For today, we're going to be focusing on the top 7 asset categories, as highlighted on the right-hand side of the image. And that's both in the interest of time, but also these capture the vast majority of our cumulative asset management value, and therefore cover the vast majority of asset management risk. Lastly, for this slide, it's really important to share that the district is a municipal leader in the asset management space, but our information reflects our best available data on condition, age, and cost estimates, and we're always finding ways to continuously improve our work. So before we dive into each of the asset management category dashboards, this graphic is very important to share. So what is it showing? So firstly, obviously, asset condition deteriorates over its lifetime, but capital expenditures is needed along the way to keep assets at its target condition. So you're going to see 3 of those dash lines. That target condition is the middle dash line, and this is just representative of what's going on. But when we think of asset condition, we look at 3 factors. The first factor we look at is the physical condition. So how old is it? What's its wear and tear? The second factor we look at is demand and capacity. So is it undersized, or is it in the wrong location? And then the third thing we look at is functionality. Is it accessible? Is it safe? And is it suitable for its current purpose? So historically, asset condition and age was the primary factor for when to replace assets. But with a changing climate and a growing population, we are starting to see that these other factors are starting to drive more decisions on asset management. So now we're going to move into the dashboards. So the first one we're talking about is the transportation. So I'm going to spend a couple of extra minutes on here just to guide you around what each dashboard looks like, because they all look quite familiar. So on the top left-hand side here is the estimated cumulative replacement value of all of our transportation assets, and that's shown to be roughly $1 billion. Below that, on the lower left-hand side in blue, there's a number of highlighted key stats, just for your awareness. You know, for things like we have about 350 kilometres of roads, we have about 190 kilometres of sidewalks, and that's close to $700 million in asset value. We have 19 bridges, which is over $100 million in value, and then we have over 3,000 street lights and almost 60 traffic signals. This is to give you a flavour of what's within that particular asset category. In the centre here, you'll see overall condition, and this is a rating that is from A through to F. So A represents a very good condition, and F is a very poor condition. As you can see here, the condition for our transportation asset system is considered B, which we define that as good. When we look at the right of this, it breaks down the physical condition with some subcategories here on the lower right-hand side. And so you might notice that there's some red and some orange in here. This particular example is actually not one to worry about too much. This is just a really good representation of annual replacement and renewal of assets. And this is quite typical of what you'll see in most of our dashboards. But if you have a keen eye, you'll also see that there's a grey bar, and that's where sidewalks are. What that's really representing is that we don't have enough data, or we haven't really analysed that sufficiently to have confidence in sharing what a grading system is. You'll see that in a handful of dashboards, and this is part of that whole continuous improvement process. On the upper right of this image, you'll see also as it relates to our average age. So what there is in white is what we expect for a service life, and then what you see there in green is the average of what those assets are for each of those categories. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of data that goes into it. So for the purposes of this evening, each of these dashboards, Council, we've just provided you with 3 takeaways for each of the service area, three items for each of the asset categories, sorry. So the first one is, overall our transportation system condition is rated as B, which is good. And this is primarily because we have a really good steady state of road repaving targets and capital renewal programs. The second element to share with you is that we do have some aging assets. And so our community is densifying and we're experiencing climate change. And putting all of these together, there are increased demands on our transportation system. So when we think about collector roads, when we think about bridges, when we think about culverts, they're all experiencing additional pressure from more density or from a changing climate. And the third item here is improving data support, better decision making on asset planning. And that's kind of what I was talking about before in our sidewalks as a really good example. We do have some data gaps. This is an area that we continue to try to improve. And so we're working hard as a team to make improvements in those areas to support better decision making in the future as well. Next, we'll move on to our buildings asset category. So as a brief overview, we own 105 buildings within the district. Becky and I will see that there's 106 there. That's because we have a co-ownership on the Jerry Brewer building, which is within the city of North Vancouver. And collectively, those 100 or so buildings also come close to $900 million. And why do we own buildings? And that's obviously because many of the buildings we have are critical in allowing us to deliver district services, while some of the other buildings that we've acquired have just been strategically purchased in the past. Our average age of buildings is around 42 years, with many nearing or exceeding its useful life. So with many of them reaching their end of service life in the next 10 to 20 years without significant investment or intervention coming through. Overall, we do see this asset category as a poor physical condition, but what's not shown here is that's focusing on physical condition, but there's things like functionality as well. So things like accessibility of some of our buildings and things of those regards as well isn't necessarily fully reflected in this dashboard at the present time. So council, what are some 3 takeaways for you? So the first one here is just really repeating that we do have buildings that are aging. The portfolio overall is considered in poor condition, and we do have a growing backlog of deferred maintenance that needs to start being addressed. Otherwise, we're going to have further degradation of our buildings, and that's going to result in some higher long-term costs. The second element is that a number of our buildings aren't meeting its functional or service needs. And so what we're doing is that many of our buildings that we're seeing are becoming outdated, or they're not suitable for how the services are intended to be delivered today. So we see that some things like functional limitations, program changes, demographics, regulatory updates and the likes, they're all increasing pressure into our buildings asset category. And the last item here is that historically, the need to repair and replace buildings has been growing and funding hasn't necessarily kept pace. These are quite expensive assets in some regards because we are talking about some of our bigger assets. And so collectively, as a team, we're starting to make more strategic decisions to clarify what our priorities are and starting to better manage those long-term risks. Next I'm going to be moving on to is our water system. So just some key stats here. So we own approximately 360 kilometres of water mains, and that covers about 90% of our $670 million current replacement value of this category. Along with the reservoirs, the pump stations and the valves, this system helps distribute potable water that is supplied by Metro Vancouver to district homes and district businesses. Overall, the physical condition, as you can see at the bottom here, is rated as good. But you can see from the age profile, we also have a really good long-standing and effective replacement program. Really, all of those blue bars that you see at the top right-hand side, they're well below that red line, which is good asset management practice. 3 key takeaways, a little bit of a repeat of what I've been sharing as an overview. The water network is in good condition, and it's really based on our risk-based replacement strategy. And we use GIS to help prioritize our aging assets. And just as an FYI, we try to replace around 4 to 5 kilometres of mains every year. The second element is that we are starting to see the demand on the water distribution system is starting to increase. So with ongoing growth, with ongoing densification, it's increasing that demand. This is particularly the case when we think about fire flow standards. So when we have a single family home and then we go to something more multi-family style, there are different fire flow standards that are required. So as we densify, there's more pressure put onto our system there. The last item here, the third item to share with you, is that to help manage demand and support conservation, one of the areas being implemented are having water meters installed on new developments and on building permits over a certain value, which is $300,000. And we know that this was a recent discussion with council, and staff are in the process of preparing their report back to council on that matter. Next, we'll look at the sanitary system. So we own almost 400 kilometres of sanitary mains, and the system value is approximately $400 million. And why we have this system is that it collects and conveys sewage from all the properties in the district, and it goes to Metro Vancouver's wastewater treatment plant for treatment. So one thing to look at here is the age profile of the upper right-hand corner. I really want to pay your attention there. This is a good example where a number of our asset categories, we did a lot of development in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, with many of those assets now starting to reach their end of service life. So this will be a common theme that you will see in a number of these dashboards. And I think this representation of how close those tall blue bars are to the red line is a really good representation of maybe our next focus area. In terms of some key takeaways, today the system, the sanitary system is rated as good. However, as I've shared with many of that system built out in the 60s, many components are approaching their end of service life. And accordingly, over the next decade, this will probably be a focus area for us to pivot and pay more attention to as we think about our long-term asset management planning. The second element is high flows are increasing costs and risks. So what that really means is that we talk about I&I, or what we call inflow and infiltration. And so this is basically where leaks are infiltrating into the sanitary system, i.e. groundwater, or rainfall is flowing into the system through an incorrect connection, such as when you have stormwater from a roof and it goes into the sanitary system instead of the storm system. So with our community densifying, these challenges are only being further exacerbated. And furthermore, Metro Vancouver is shifting in treatment pricing in the coming years for what's called a wet weather pricing system. And so we're trying to reduce the impacts of these from both public and private infrastructure, and it's becoming more urgent. The last item here is that in terms of the third key takeaway is that we're improving how we model the renewal program to help better plan renewals and funding needs. And so really the whole idea is that moving forward, we really want to try and minimize service disruption. So how can we better plan and prioritize our asset management in order to do that? I'm going to quickly pause. I've spoken probably for about 10 minutes or so. We're about halfway through the dashboards. Just want to canvas council. Do you want me to pause or just get through it all?
It's like you're doing well.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
No worries. It's a lot of information, certainly. Okay, so now we're moving into our drainage system. So this is our complete stormwater system, and that really collects and conveys rainwater. So wherever it falls, it goes through our system and it's discharged. So we have about 360 kilometres of stormwater mains, and we have hundreds of culverts. And collectively, that's about $500 million of asset value. This asset category also includes our debris basins and our debris barriers as well. So this is an important one as we think about a changing climate as well. Just like the other assets, as you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, the age profile is really showing that many of our assets are approaching their end of asset life. And so this is, again, another asset area where in the coming decade or so, we'll start to be paying more and more attention in terms of trying to deal with that quite peak that you can see that's on the horizon.
Can I just ask, like, on that peak, like, how do we interpret that graph to the list on the left?
So there was many ways to illustrate it. We could have broken down that graph based on all the different categories on the left. Really what the intention of the visual on the upper right is that we collectively saw the drainage system as a complete system. And so there are some minor shading differences, but generally speaking, my suggestion for council to take away here is that this is showing that we built most of our stormwater system in the 60s. That's kind of as we expanded, whether it was a main, whether it's a culvert, whatever the case may be, as we develop further and further with our land development. And so what this is showing is that with, somewhere between 50 and 100-year service lives, we're actually coming to that end of that peak. So with that huge increase, what is that, 60 years ago, we now have to deal with a lot of those aspects. Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out, I mean, it's rated as good, but I'm just trying to figure out from that graph, how much of it needs to be replaced and the cost. Like, you know, it's great that it says B, that kind of like, whew, okay, I feel a little bit better that it doesn't say D. But it's the cost.
Yeah.
Because those are not cheap programs?
Yeah, so I would suggest that, so there's two pieces here. So one, as we go through our annual capital program, particularly look at the 10+ year horizon, we start to put some of these assets into that really long-term planning aspect. But I'd kind of really point council to, I think it's slide 3, where we have that graphic that has the curve. And so with these particular assets getting closer and closer to their end of asset life, if we leave, it might be considered good today, but if we continue leaving it, that's going to very quickly go exponentially worse. That's kind of really what that graphic's identifying, without us coming in and intervening now. So the longer we leave something past good, the more that we can anticipate bringing it back up to an entire condition. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything?
I could add something there, because when you look at this graph and you look at the sanitary graph, you see this peak arising, right? And what it's really telling us that in the next 10 years, we need a more robust replacement program for both drainage and sanitary in the same way that we've been doing for the last number of years on water. So when you look at the water one, we're in relatively good shape. We've been working through that 5 kilometers a year, replacing a water main program. That's going to come, the need to do that will scale back, and we would like to transition to the sanitary network. And then, there's the drainage network is similar, where we're going to see a need for a more sort of proactive replacement program.
So with that, we're gonna need also a more robust presentation of the budget and how we're going to pay for all of these priorities that are coming to the end of their life, and how that's going to be managed financially up against everything else that we're facing. I mean, I thought we had already been at the peak and the height of challenges, but it seems like we're just the mountains getting bigger. And so that's going to be really something as we go into the future. How do we do that? How are we prioritizing it? How are we looking at our budget? Are we living within our means?
I have some additional comments from Mr. Milburn.
I just wanted to add to the conversation that the usefulness of having this level of understanding and data is that we can now think about the interrelationship of replacement of infrastructure. So whenever you replace underground infrastructure, you do a cut, and you're cutting into asphalt. And so the more that we can do to plan for co-aligning water, sanitary, storms, streets, the more efficient we can be with the taxpayers' dollars. Additionally, when we look at the redevelopment of our town centers, we can also look at how we can focus investment in income into the replacement of the adjacent infrastructure into those same pieces of infrastructure we know are aging. And so very useful, and there's really good strategies that we can deploy so that we can do it in a most efficient way.
Okay.
Yeah, just
Councilor Back as well.
Thanks. Actually, my question was related to Mr. Milburn's comment. So do we know where the majority of the oldest infrastructure is, be it drainage, water, or sanitary? Because it's in certain parts of the community, is some of it closer to areas that are being looked at for redevelopment, like near town centers?
Yes, we will be able to do that via GIS. So all our
Right.
segments for drainage and sanitary, it's all data within GIS that we can look at, and I'm sure we can put a heat map which ones are oldest, which ones are recently replaced.
Just be interested to see like where it aligns with, to your point, potential redevelopment when you're making that cut.
I would just add to that, in general, when you look at the physical condition, which is age-based, it'd be the areas that developed a long time ago, or either in the first
Neighborhoods.
shape, as we renew, kind of this gets renewed as part of that development process. I think what you're flagging also here, though, is that demand capacity and sometimes function can come into play with a lot of these assets, where it might become the capacity that's the issue more than the physical condition. And so that's where we need to be we're really strategic in making sure that we don't replace an old pipe with a pipe that's too small, and that we don't get in a situation where we have to replace a new pipe with a bigger pipe because of development plans and things. So we're trying to knit this all together and make sure that we're right sizing it at the right time.
And now with water, you said we try to do about 4 to 5 kilometers of water mains each year. Is there another number for these other sections that we aim to, and has that number increased or stay
I
the
don't
same?
have that at hand in terms of that specific question. Generally speaking, our asset management plans identify what is on the list that's coming up. So that starts to then define the projects. But in terms of like the water main replacement program is something that we've just embedded every year, and we know that we're going to do 4 to 5 kilometres a year because it's been kind of a bit of a steady state. We can certainly go away and kind of share
It
that.
might be useful as we go to planning, like, do we need to
Some
increase?
additional comments from Mr. Stewart to reply to, Mr. Stewart?
Yeah, I just want to comment that,
Oh, I'm gonna have
One of
to,
the leaders-
we're just gonna turn your volume back up. Go for it.
okay, sorry here. We are one of the leaders in Canada around asset management. We actually take a really, really responsible position on that. But I think what the fundamental message that staff are trying to provide to you is that notwithstanding how good we're doing, the provincial requirements for changing the density and all the rest of it are really contradictory to our ability to continue to maintain our assets. And so I don't know how we go about making them understand that it's going to be very, very, very challenging, not only for new areas, but for our existing system to actually maintain our infrastructure. And that message has not got through the province. They don't understand it. And they will knock down, our ability to make that kind of progress. But I'm really concerned about the rest of the province because they are nowhere near where we are. Nowhere near where we are in terms of understanding what our infrastructure is, what we have to do, planning for it. This is going to be a real challenge, and this is one of the reasons that we're bringing forward this information to you, whether it's parkland or asset management or facilities, is that I don't think the province understands the state of a lot of our infrastructure, how challenging it's going to be, how expensive it's going to be to actually just maintain what we have as opposed to, bringing new assets on board. And I think there's an impression there that the new development will pay for it all, but they place so many constraints on us in terms of being able to transfer that usefulness in terms of investment to infrastructure and assets and parks. So it's going to be a very, very challenging period over the next 3 or 4 years.
So thank you for your comments. So it seems like we have a pretty strong case to be able to advocate to the province. If we package this up in a way that we can take it to the province and say, look, we know what we can service now, never mind new, demands that are being placed on us. Are we?
Making sure.
And is that something that we can do maybe with the other 2 municipalities on the North Shore too?
In short, yes, and Mr. Milburn, feel free to add to this. We're trying to find every opportunity to remind senior levels of government, whether it's a utility network that's underground, whether it's a transportation system, whether it's things like schools and hospitals, every opportunity we're finding, we are reminding other forms of government that, hey, like it's not just about housing, you need to have all this infrastructure that's supporting it. I'm not sure if Dan, you want to add anything?
Just to echo that, to say that ever since we started having conversations with the province with the Housing Supply Act a couple of years ago, we with the council's direction and certainly the mayor, were putting infrastructure at the top of the list and saying, if you have a minimum amount of housing that can be provided, you also need to have a minimum amount of infrastructure support to meet the community's needs, and not just municipal, but also the provincial infrastructure and the school district infrastructure. So that was top of mind and top of all our responses to the province at every step, and including with the OCP conversations we've been having recently, every outreach we've been doing with all the different agencies, we've been echoing that message over and over and over, because they have very long planning horizons as well, 10 years to get a school built. And so that's even if it's funded, right? Emphasizing that at every step that we have at our disposal, and certainly council's efforts in that regard is hopefully helpful too.
I think it's important to just have it at this granular level too, because the word infrastructure is thrown around a lot, but when you see no, look at it, this is our drainage, this is basic stuff that we're gonna need some direct support on.
But it's also the cost though of that direct support, right? So have we have we explained it in financial terms to them? Not just the challenges of, not receiving, money from senior levels of government to build the infrastructure. Have we looked back to show where we were, what redevelopment has assisted with, what it hasn't assisted with, where are those gaps, and the financial situations that we're in, given the, the economy and the constant, peaks and valleys?
Yeah, so what I'd answer to that, and again, Mr. Moore, please put to add, is that we're looking from the infrastructure engineering side, we're awaiting an upcoming discussion as it relates to where do we move forward in terms of the province's 22,369 units and where it goes, and having that conversation with council. Once we know what the scenario is that we're kind of working with, that is going to tailor what the infrastructure ask might be over the course of the next 20 years. And that's going to be able to help our teams, our collective teams, really identify, okay, in order to meet your needs with the style of community that we want moving forward, here is what that infrastructure looks like. Will the number be large? Yeah. It will.
But isn't that the cart before the horse? Not understanding what the costs of this provincial scenario in regards to this housing needs report? Like, we're going to determine where the housing is gonna go and then talk about the cost of it? I think that we should be determining scenarios to look at, to give consideration to. Because by the time you put that into legislation, or by the time that's part of the OCP, it's too late. Because the zoning isn't automatic if it's amended as part of the OCP. I know, but we gotta make it again. This is the time where, the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Like, this is ridiculous. We're never gonna be able to afford this.
Mr. Milburn, additional comments?
Just very briefly to say that, while we'll be planning for that many units, they won't be built in the next year. So, same with the OCP in 2011, there was a series of implementation plans for the town centers. We would recommend updating that information if council approves a change in direction for the units, and that will take time. But absolutely, we're trying to acquire the best information. Well, what we do know for sure, based on lots of empirical evidence over many years, is that building in areas of like high amenity and large support infrastructure, like along our transit corridors and so on, where we've been planning for decades to develop, is much more efficient from a cost perspective on a per unit basis than delivering in our hinterlands, right? If we were to put units out on the edge of the community, it's much more expensive to deliver the necessary infrastructure. And certainly those communities that have implemented kind of really aggressive info strategies, they are very quickly waking up to that reality, because the development isn't necessarily happening in those suburbs in a coherent way. It's happening like mushrooms growing up. That's what we've heard from other communities. So definitely investment, and Metro Vancouver has actually done a lot of research on this in terms of the efficiency of investment in existing areas of redeveloping, rather than building greenfield or building on the edge.
Mr. Stewart, additional comments?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Milburn just pointed out his comment about planning for decades. That's what the district has done. For decades, we've tried to be responsible. And quite frankly, the recent legislation does not reflect an understanding even of that planning and that commitment to make our communities sustainable. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a political comment, but I don't see anybody understanding at the provincial level what the consequences are of this.
I think the FCM has been fairly effective at raising the issue on infrastructure deficit with municipalities at that level. UBCM would probably work with them more to ramp up more of that discussion, something that broadly represents all of the municipalities. My question for you, Mr. Coleman, on this particular slide, I think that the disparity from a neighborhood that's in good shape to bad shape, this is the slide that's most important on, because when we have a storm, it's predictive of where it's going to fail. And so I guess versus water and buildings and all of the other kinds of things, this one, the geographic distribution of our capacity really, really matters. And so I guess my question would be, could we color code a map to show areas where we have additional drainage infrastructure and capacity versus neighborhoods where we don't have additional infrastructure capacity. I know we are using the stormwater management tools to address that in new builds and such, but my understanding is like there's some creek areas and spaces that already we don't have sufficient stormwater management to meet our normal needs, let alone an extraordinary event.
Yeah, I think staff can certainly take that away and develop some type of graphic that kind of conveys that story. I think this is also, you know, one of the challenging aspects. It's on the next slide, but I'll keep it on this one for now. This is an area that is quite susceptible to climate change. And you've kind of started to highlight that, Mayor, a little, because this is where, if we look back to October, that's an example of what the more frequent and intense storms are going to look like. When we talk about culverts, debris basins, the stormwater system, it's this asset category. And so, you know, every year we're learning more, and every year that we learn more, we know that that condition component may not necessarily be being met. So this is particularly the case for this one. I'm sure it's on all the asset categories, but in terms of the stormwater drainage, as we think back to 6 months ago, whenever October was, yeah, this is an area where climate change is a key component to visually seeing how the asset's performing.
I've mentioned this to the minister before, and I think that the legislation, particularly Bill 44, could have been a lot stronger if there was a negotiation back and forth with municipalities to some degree, where we could say, you know, identify areas that have excess infrastructure and space and say, hey, we could go a little more here and a little less there, and we could do it without hitting that tipping point of needing a huge infrastructure investment. And I wish there was that sort of back and forth. Instead, we got pin drops with radiuses that didn't make any sense to our available infrastructure in that area. So maybe there's a potential for a maturation of that process, but I find it, you know, it needs to be a part of the discussion, the availability of excess infrastructure capacity into that building. They have to be connected. But Michelle, yeah.
I just want to add the point taken on the vulnerability of this with storms and climate change, but just to point out that the sanitary system actually has that same vulnerability, because we hear a lot about flow and infiltration from cross connections and leaking pipes, and this wet weather flow that's coming. So there's a lot of correlation there as well that we're concerned about, and sometimes we'll get that sanitary sewer backup in storms as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, just before I know that, before we get back to the presentation, I know there's been a lot of conversation about the OCP update and the likes as well, and Dan's kind of alluded to it. My advice to council, and this will be in future discussions when we do talk about the OCP, the closer we keep it to the existing OCP we've been working for the last 20 years, the less infrastructure need there's going to be. When we're talking about tens of thousands of potential new properties, you're still going to need to be upsizing those pipes that might be around. So that's just, I know that there's a lot of discussion on that. I know that there's probably some frustration in terms of the timelines, but that's where probably the conversation will go before the summer break.
Councillor Pope, your comments on drainage, or do you want to?
Drainage.
Okay,
So
perfect.
it's interesting to me that actually 31% of our drainage system is in poor, very poor to poor, which is significant. It's not just the 12% that's in very poor condition.
Yeah, so through this, you know, if I compare it back to, say, a buildings asset category, you'll see a lot more orange and red. What this is generally indicating, and it's similar to our streets and transportation asset, we are going to see a little bit of red here and there and orange, but that just means that it forms part of our annual cycle. So when it gets into that red and that orange, that's when it pops into as a project for us to come and upgrade. You know, we don't want to necessarily be over-investing. So for example, we can't have every asset category in A. We would be over-investing in our infrastructure, and that would be kind of like gold plating and Cadillac and everything. And so we do need to see some of our assets get towards the end of asset life, and just naturally you'll start to see it kind of get to the right side of that graphic. Do we want to try and give attention to the ones particularly in red as quickly as possible? That's ideal.
Some
And you
additional
mentioned-
comments from Mr. Stewart as well, please. Mr. Stewart, go ahead.
I just want to continue with Peter's comments. I mean, the fact of the matter is this is a simple representation of our asset condition. The fact of the matter is that there are some assets that are very strategic and need to be worked on. And the fact that it may be 12%, they may not need to be worked on because they're not strategic. And in fact, we need to focus our energy on the strategic ones. So I just want to assure Councillor Pope that it's not a matter of the system being in disarray. It's a matter of really strategically actually controlling our assets, managing our assets, and making some choices on a constant basis.
Councillor Pope?
You mentioned very quickly the new Metro wet weather pricing system. What is that?
I would recommend that would be a discussion for another topic. That's
Yeah.
quite a significant topic of discussion. So I would recommend that we have a separate discussion with council, but effectively, yeah, I'll let you answer. Just
Scaring me
No,
now.
just in a nutshell, it doesn't have to do with the drainage, it would be more on the sewers.
Why not?
It's when there's wet weather, storm water in the sanitary system
Yeah.
that makes its way to the treatment plant for treatment, so, Metro Bank's gonna be, they're introducing an additional charge for that wet weather flow and incentivize or encouraging municipalities to reduce that over time.
Oh my God.
So can I add to that? The two municipalities with the highest
Delta.
rate of INI are us and Delta,
Yeah,
in part because we're a rainforest,
yeah.
but, yeah. So
So
we,
just to add to that, like, at least 50%, we estimate anyways, that 50% of that INI comes from private property, because a lot of the cross connections or leaking pipes could be within the private property, and so we also have to find ways to get our residents or our businesses to upgrade their connections, which is part of our sewer bylaws and things that we've talked about before as well, why we ask for them to be renewed when they do a building permit. So yeah, it's an important topic for another day.
Well, we'll have to add that to our discussion agenda then on another day.
yeah, I want to answer the question why Vancouver and New West
Don't
don't pay
have to
wet
do it.
weather, even though they have fully combined sewers and dump all of their rainwater into it.
And no one wants to share the costs.
Easy.
No.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just jump back here. We've covered off on most of these pieces, and so I just don't want to repeat. First topic's talking about when assets were built, they're getting towards their end of asset life. We've been talking about climate change and capacity constraints. And then just, again, another piece here in terms of, for some of our categories, some of the data is quite limited. You know, for example, we have hundreds of culverts. We'd love to get more data about our culverts. And so that's kind of another key area of our drainage network as well. Parks and open spaces. So our parks and open space assets, they really support obviously a wide range of recreation and community services. So things like sports fields and playgrounds, trails, court structures, and horticultural features as well. So overall, this is a very broad category, but generally speaking, we identify the condition to be good. But these are varied across the asset classes given their broad purview. So as you can see kind of in the lower right-hand image here, there's a lot of difference between what you see as green and yellow. And then renewal planning is really something that we're looking at refining. So with such a diverse asset base, with incomplete asset inventories, and with some underdeveloped maintenance strategies, this is kind of an area of focus for us to improve the data quality. So in terms of just some general themes for council, you know, as we think about climate, as we think about additional densities, that's obviously creating pressures on our parks and open spaces. And it's coming from multiple angles. You know, on one hand, you know, we have bigger storms and wind events, and they're damaging things like bridges and fences and picnic shelters. And on the other hand, as our community densifies, the demand for accessible outdoor spaces continues to rise. So there's multiple aspects here applying pressure to our parks and open spaces. The second aspect I've already spoken to, you know, there are data gaps that we're wanting to continue to address. You know, for example, we have an incomplete data collection on underground utilities in our park spaces. That's an area we really want to focusing on into improving long-term decision-making. And then the third element is that we're recognizing natural assets. And so we want to really be spending some more time of ensuring how can the district be more resilient in climate change and extreme weather events, and what investment might be needed for the health and function of these natural assets. And that's an area of work that many municipalities are trying to figure out right now. Vehicles and fleets. So just to give you a quick snapshot, we have around 350 fleet and registered vehicles. And so those registered vehicles could include things like trailers and grass cutters. And really having a well-functioning fleet is critical to allowing us to deliver all of our core services. So think of solid waste operations, snow and ice response, and fire services. A lot of these that you see on the screen here are really supporting our core services as well. Now, some 3 key takeaways for you is that, generally speaking, our fleet is currently well maintained and it's rated as good. And that's really due to regular inspections, preventative maintenance, and our defined replacement cycles. The second element here is that this asset category is particularly susceptible in recent years to rising costs and long lead times. So think of inflation, tariffs, supply chain delays, exchange rate issues. Many of the vehicles are in US dollars. That gives you a sense that this is a particularly vulnerable asset that's got the pressures of added cost growth. And, you know, in a particular year, if we have a fire asset, so a fire vehicle, that could easily double what a particular annual request might be.
Mr. Stewart has a comment. Mr. Stewart?
Yeah, just a question for Peter. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, it'd be helpful if council understood what it requires to replace a panel van versus a fire truck versus a garbage truck. Because it's actually, I mean, I see these costs coming across my desk, and it's absolutely astounding what the expected costs are. And these are through open bids, and they're crazy. Anyway, Peter, if you want to comment on that.
I'll hand it to Nicola to answer that one.
Okay, so I think the question was just some example of costs of some of these big vehicles. So fire trucks can be $2 to $4 million now, depending on type, and there's been about a 100% increase over the past 10 years. A garbage truck, for example, would be about 600,000, and we're looking at $1 million if we get the electric vehicle version, which of course has some, you know, operating savings when we go EV, as well as the maintenance, of course. I mean, some of the snow and ice tandems, 5 tons are 500,000 easily, whereas an F550 is like 275,000. So these are all big numbers for a big. If I don't actually have a panel truck here, the smaller vehicles, but you know, in general, I'd say our vehicles are all over $50,000 a piece. Street sweeper, 500,000. Yeah, those are just some examples.
You were commenting, Nicola, on just the cost of replacing the equipment that actually plows the bicycle paths is $25,000. I mean, that's, anyway, very expensive.
Yeah.
It's what?
Just to clarify.
Yeah, no, I think you're referring to the mini sweeper for our bicycle paths. It was actually over 200,000.
I was gonna say, I think you're missing a zero. So,
I had Councillor Pope. Oh, I thought sorry about that. Councillor Muir.
I think it would be really, really interesting to sort of go back and see since the inception of the OCP, what this has all cost, what growth has cost. Metro's already taken a position that growth has not paid for growth. And I think we need to understand what the gap is in that calculation, so we can look forward and plan, because it hasn't paid for any of this, and it's costing an enormous amount. And there's this thinking that if we continue to increase the tax base, somehow we get out of these problems, but it's just not happening. You know, we've come from a place where we relied on senior levels of government years ago to build housing, and they didn't. So then we took that over. Like, downloading over the years has been, and it continues to grow. I mean, I think the fear is that the taxes are going to, the federal government knows that we pay some of the lowest property taxes in this country. And how's that going to impact us going forward? you know, where are the changes that are coming in regards to that scenario? Because although we pay some of the lowest taxes, we have one of the highest costs of living in this country, in the world. So I just, you know, I think it would be good information to share with the province, because the province seems to think that this is all going to work itself out. And we're becoming quite concerned with the cost of all of this and how we're gonna pay for it. And I don't know if the community is going to support it all, quite frankly. I really don't.
After seeing the provinces going through all of this themselves with their own budgets, with all of their own equipment, this is a broad, widespread problem, but you know, they'll see it mostly through contract escalation, and we see it with actually purchasing directly. Councillor Ma, on this slide, or we have 2 more slides left until the 10-minute presentation is done. Are you
Yeah, you were so quick on that, Peter. That was so.
I'm gonna let Peter finish then, and we'll come back right to you after that.
Third item here is just, it's a support service for our fleet and equipment. So as the community starts to expand, we have more services. Obviously, there's additional pressure on there. This is really just a summary of some of the shared challenges across all our service areas and assets. I've touched on all of these. You know, aging infrastructure, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about population growth, expanding service demand. So we as a community, you know, over the last 20 years, we've changed in terms of what we've been doing. And then ultimately sustainable funding. That's been something we've danced around with a number of comments this evening. The real purpose of the presentation tonight was what is kind of the state of the union as it relates to assets, it's part 1. And then part 2, the finance team will start to be having discussions with the Finance and Audit Committee on what do we start to maybe think about as we think about more sustainable funding opportunities longer term on that front. Here's just some next steps, just for your awareness. Again, I'm not going to touch on this too much, it's in the package, but these are just some key areas that we're looking at trying to find some improvements. So it's around things like how we collect or analyze data. We're looking at opportunities for improving there. We're looking at filling some gaps and maybe some underrepresented asset classes, such as our natural assets, our land holdings, and other physical infrastructure. And then, you know, how are we clarifying on how we do asset management on buildings that may not necessarily we fully oversee the asset management of. So an example here is the Jerry Brewer building in the city of North Vancouver. It houses both NASIM and the RCMP. So how do we think about that from an asset management perspective from the district? And I think I'll leave it there. So yeah, the last things I really just want to touch on is just reiterating some pieces here is that, you know, the district really started our asset management team in earnest the last 20 or so years, really led by our finance team, supported by engineering, and so, as well as many other staff. And so I think it's really important to say that, you know, there's a lot of data that gets analyzed. Vivian from my team who's here is overseeing kind of the framework for asset management. And so while, you know, some of the information here may not necessarily look so rosy, I think it's the fact that we've spent 20 years getting to this point that we can actually have these types of discussions with council, which I'm sure that many other municipalities may not necessarily be in that position. And that kind of goes to Mr. Stewart's point that, you know, we've been doing a lot of this embedment of asset management into our work. So with that, I think I'm just going to finish up the presentation, and hopefully the information we've shared with you provides you with some information as we start to think about post-summer break and the next budget cycle for what that could look like as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, additional comments?
Yeah, just last comments. I just wanted to reiterate the reasons that we're bringing this stuff together is so that we can have a budget discussion in September. Because these 3 areas, asset management, parks management, et cetera, are really critical to the character of our community. And we need to be making really strategic decisions around what's important to us going forward for the next 20 years. And so I'm really looking forward, as we talked about the OCP, et cetera, that we really start to actually recreate what we expect North Vancouver to be and look like in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. And so that's going to be the challenge for council. And when I said, and I'm sorry if I offended anybody, we have to think big. I'll use small, not rather than little, in deference to you, your worship. But we need to think really big, because we're at a really critical point with all the provincial legislation, all the changes that are underway. We need to really make sure that we're doing a good job that creates a community that we're going to be really proud about for the next 50 years, not the next 20 years.
Mr. Stewart?
That's my goal.
Thank you. I've got Councillors Ma and Hanson.
Thank you, Peter and your team. A lot of information to digest. Some of the questions I had, you kind of answered, and Dave, Mr. Stewart touched upon. I just want to touch on one point. In the report, it talks about a financial gap. And there's a big number there, 24 million per year. And I know that finance is supposed to be coming back to the Finance and Audit Committee, a meeting with some options. But tied into that, in the report, there was a couple of times where there's some data gaps. So will those data gaps be filled so we can get some clear strategies in time for the next financial plan cycle?
Yeah, so what I would say, Councillor Ma, is that asset management is something we do day in, day out. So as we learn more information, we update our information. So we're intending that this style of reporting for our assets would be something that would happen annually. So if some of our gaps of data, I doubt we're going to be able to magically fill all of that before the fall. But say if we do something in the next 6 months, when we come back in 2026 to talk about this or share it with council, we'll have some of those refinements done. So we're going to continually be updating what that looks like. And what the number that's in the report, that there's going to be a part 2 discussion on what are some sustainable funding options for that $24 million gap. It's really going to be informed by, best available information. And so a big component of that is across all of our assets that we've shared this evening, but buildings is the one area, and that shouldn't really be a big surprise for council. When you look at all the condition assessments, generally speaking, from a physical perspective, it's the only one that really stands out. And then there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area, and that's where a big bulk of that 24 million a year kind of identifies in that buildings portfolio.
I'm encouraged by the comments earlier that, our asset management is relatively in good conditions. Like there's a lot of B scores, but if we don't take care of it, it's going to come down really quick. So that's on my mind, and I hear Mr. Stewart say, we've done well, but we have to. My takeaway is that we really have to live within our means, set some priorities to give staff that direction, and then keep to them. So that's my takeaway. If that's what was intended, job done. Thank you.
Councillor Hanson?
Yeah, thank you very much, Your Worship. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to everyone who prepared all this information, which I did study considerable depth. I'm not sure I understand all of it, but thank you. It was very interesting. Very big picture is that notwithstanding our very best efforts, we do have an infrastructure deficit, which means future taxpayers are going to be paying for assets that have already been built and consumed. There is a pending fiscal challenge facing the district. So I've always supported the 1% levy for infrastructure. Maybe we should consider increasing that. Make it clear that we do need to provision future infrastructure. But one category of assets struck me as I went through the whole thing, and that's with respect to the buildings overview. And it was real estate holdings, 78 real estate holdings. And unlike every other category of asset that is described in these documents, it doesn't serve a social or community purpose. It's an investment of the district, I gather. Otherwise, you wouldn't be characterizing it as real estate holdings. So an idea I'd like to put out there is there some way we can contemplate addressing the real estate, the infrastructure deficit, this looming financial challenge that hovers over the district, by repurposing this asset that is real estate holdings.
Can we define real estate holdings? Because I think it also includes a lot of our social enterprises when we lease back out to Hollyburn and other groups like that.
Buildings that are used.
And also our business contracts like the McDonald's Lynn Valley complex, the businesses down on Welch, all of those, they're all in that.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
As a facilities question, I'll refer to Cliff.
do you want?
What's in real estate holdings?
So, yeah, I have the list of what's in real estate holdings. It's not the social enterprises, we have a social services section for that, but it is the Main Street building, commercial building. It is Lynn Valley Village, for the, other than the library portion of that. And then we've got some residential homes on Hunter Street with several residential homes, Chapman Way, et cetera. These are buildings that they would acquire the land for strategic purposes, and in the interim, we're renting those out. And well, we put also things like the old fire training center in there. Our plan is to demolish that and make better use of that land, but in the meantime, it's considered, now it's surplus to fire's needs, so it's considered commercial buildings. So those are the.
What's the Main Street building?
It's the music building, right, down by right on the corner of Lynn and Main Street. There is Lord Cohen there, or what's yeah, I think it's
Name of
Lord-
music.
yeah. And there's a music store. It's right, the old animal shelter used to be in behind it.
It's like a guitar store.
Yeah, there's a few, and there's a vet in
And
there.
a martial arts.
So I'm correct to assert then that those are assets of the district that are not being used for a social or community purpose. They're being used for a business purpose.
Yes, and we look at their importance too. Some of them are self-funded. There's a return that's sat out, and real estate and properties insurance, but there's terms to that. Others we have identified as being sort of less important. It's really the land that's important, and so we may be covering our costs through the rent or whatever, but it can certainly support, but it's not supporting the district service.
Got additional comments from Ms. Ryder?
Through your worship, there's a number of properties that we have bought for development purposes. So we have a number of the houses around Hunter Street, which would be consolidated with the fire hall on Mountain Highway. So it is a number of miscellaneous properties that we have bought for strategic purposes that can be amalgamated with other things. So some of those are the sites we may look for housing on or other municipal purposes, so they are available to the municipality for other uses. So some of them are, some of the houses we have may be just rented at market, or we may also have some, should they contain some of the ones we have community groups in as well, or we did have some overlaps with some of those categories.
If they're being used for a shelter of some sort of community group, we put it in the social services section. So as part of our, these are just tenanted.
Thank you, and I think that's it. I think something going forward, as we face this infrastructure deficit and the taxation implications of that for the next generation of ratepayers, I think that's something we need to consider. I'll just leave it there.
Councillor Miri, did I see your hand, Councillor back? Okay, Councillor Miri, go ahead.
So I think that the conversation needs to happen, but there also has to be, I mean, we're creating more assets, rec centers and town centers, plazas, community space. If we have a gap now, what's the future gap look like? You talk about sustainable funding sources. What are those? Selling things? That's like selling a piece of your backyard to pay off your credit card. What is the sustainable funding model? What are we talking about? And that's gonna be if you're excited now, wait until we talk about that. Because I can't wait to hear what that's gonna look like. I don't know if there is one, a sustainable funding model, other than increased taxation, increased costs, for those properties, selling those properties. What is that plan? When do we talk about it? Is it gonna happen during the budget, or is it gonna happen at another meeting where we can dive into it and really look at what those options are? And can you give us some idea as to what that sustainable model sounds like?
I'll let Mr. Milburn go first with his hand up, and then I can add some comments as well.
Mr. Milburn?
I just wanted to note that it has not been the practice of the district to sell land, put that into a depreciating asset. many council decisions in the past have been to direct those funds to a land opportunity fund or a land fund so that other strategic purchases can be made with the sale of one piece of land. And so there's lots of opportunity and lots of need for strategic purposes, for transportation reasons, housing, all kinds of objectives that council may identify. But being able to use a pool of land assets to be able to buy and sell is a way to actually achieve that.
So
long
if
as the
you're,
values still go up.
so it's sales. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we're not, it hasn't been council's practice to sell land to then invest that in a depreciating asset like a building or a store. Instead, the monies are used and put into a land reserve, pardon me, and then that reserve we use to buy other lands. So it might be just a recalibration of the council's existing land base to buy lands that we know where we need more types of uses the council might want.
Okay, so the sustainable funding model question still lies. We need to get an answer for that. What's your thoughts, Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, so this slide deck again is just to talk about here's kind of where we are today, and obviously we have more assets coming online as you shared, Councillor Mary. The next part of the conversation is finance, where it talks about what are some options. They're going to be working first with the Finance and Audit Committee with some options, and then wherever that goes, obviously an update.
You can't give us a little hint as to what the options are you thinking? Ilya, are you thinking of any options right now?
Well, obviously, we're gonna need to look at some new funding models. And we're gonna have a discussion with the province because they're gonna need to be a part of that. New funding models that we could look at is maybe income taxes. The use of property taxes is getting to a point right now where maybe we've reached a limit. So we need to look at other funding models that the province could probably assist us with.
So we're renovating the house, we're buying new furniture, we're taking a nice lengthy trip to Europe, and we don't really have the money to do any of it. And that's how we have to start thinking. We are growing and building and buying and paying for things, and we can't look after our existing inventory of assets right now. And now we're being forced to build more with more services, more needs. It's so unsustainable.
I have additional comments from Mr. Milburn.
Thank you, Your Worship. Not to comment on Councilor Murray's statements, but just to note that the theoretical discussions that you mentioned, we actually do have some practical things that we need to come back and talk to council with next year. That if council gives us direction on the OCP, we will need to recalibrate the development cost charges and amendment cost charges. And based on whatever population amount is within the official community plan, then the infrastructure goes along with that at a rate that the council sets in terms of the assist factor or the amount of it that is related to growth. All of that will have to be brought back to council in short order next year.
If there was ever a time for amalgamation, this is it.
Here, here.
I mean, I see that I've always supported it quite seriously, but I don't know how this region moves forward with the costs we're facing without seriously looking at that concept for areas of this region to come together. I just don't know how we support it going forward. I don't understand how we're gonna.
Right on, Councillor Mary.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've had that debate every 4 years, and
It's
there's
never been,
no interest, I think, until the province mandates it, right?
but it's just never
I
been
get what you're
so
saying, I agree with
serious.
you.
Like they made your,
So serious.
And that's where it's gonna have to come from.
It's crazy.
We're
Even if we do that.
far afield from the slides before us.
Who chaired this meeting?
Saber rattling that's going on. Okay.
Well,
Mr. Cohen, you have any closing remarks, or you've already covered that, I guess?
I think it's all covered. I think this is just really a point in time update, and this is all about long-term asset management planning. And so there is time for us to resolve any funding gaps and the likes as well. So it's not as though we need to have a solution for this fall. So I just want to reassure council that this is kind of the first component of probably what's going to be a longer discussion. Mr. Milburn obviously has some needs with the OCP update, so we'll be trying to straddle with that as much as we can. Yeah.
One quick thing on the fleets. I'm still waiting for the utilization report on the fleets.
Should I?
We're aware of your request. We've implemented Fleetio, which is a system that's gonna allow us to give the information that you're looking for and to manage the fleet that's here as a pool. So we're just in the process of implementing that and being able to collect that data. It's tricky because it's not just mileage when we talk about the fleet, especially here. Some of these vehicles may just go out for, you know, a couple of kilometers and stay for 2 hours while they're doing an inspection and things. So we're really just trying to make sure that we gather that information and that data that we need. So we've got a system that's rolled out now, and we're starting to collect that data and we'll be able to provide that.
So when would that be?
Is that,
When would that be?
I'll have to get back to you, but we're aware of your request. Okay.
We have a very unsophisticated way of saying that there probably is more fleet than we need, because when you have a windstorm, you see all of the debris on the cars, and then the cars don't move for a while, you see which ones aren't moving. It's a very unsophisticated but fairly effective way to see some of the cars are not being regularly used, but yeah. All right. We still have, our policy is if we have time at the end of a council workshop to see if members of the public have any comments. Yeah. I've got some online. I do have a virtual hand as well.
Why don't you do the virtual one first? I have.
You're trying to compose yourself because it was such an exciting meeting.
We're gonna move Dr. Cost over as a panelist so that we can hear him. Just a moment. Dr. Cost, I can see you on the panel now. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Your Worship, Council. Yes, this subject of infrastructure renewal has been on my mind, as well as the review of the 2024 annual report, which on page 58 discusses some of this. I'm saddened that, in fact, the current data was not absorbed into the 2024 annual report. It would have been valuable for residents to know what's going on. I noticed that this meeting started 20 minutes late and the microphone has been rather poor. Now, comments on what's going on here is that I'd like to know what the state of the capital renewal program is. We've at least given that 15 years of 1% extra, with some small wrinkles, but effectively that over the last 15 or 20 years. And why have we not been using that money to renew our aging assets? What also is the impact on the residents when you, for example, have poor drainage? There are costs not only to the district, but also to the residents. I think that's nice to put some numbers there so we can use that to convince that we are spending money to protect our community, not just the assets of the district. I put the whole question to a AI session that I had where I gave it the full annual report data and said, tell me what's going on here. What are the hot issues? Are you able to assess if there's any glaring risks or missing elements in the report? And indeed, it came back with the obvious thing. The Metro Vancouver utility cost shock, the provincial housing mandate, some 22,000 new homes, it said, the tightening of the fiscal flexibility, where it was stated by the CFO, flexibility is expected to continue to decline, despite the fact that reserves are up, but new capital and growth reserves fell by 13 million. So there are a number of gaps or thin disclosures to address, I think, in some future report. We certainly need more capital funding gap details. It's rather opaque right now. And the pension exposure discussion has been minimal. The climate adaptation cost curves are missing, and the demographics service demand modeling has not taken place. There is no consolidated risk registry anywhere. But the
Rick, can I
bottom,
ask you for a sec so that I can get a response to the questions about that asset issue before we move on too far? So,
okay,
so just, you raised the question, since 2004, I think we missed it 1 year. There's been the 1% for asset renewal. That has been a compounding fund.
yes.
How has that been used through our reserves to address the age of our facilities and infrastructure?
61 million. Is that right, Julia?
The 1% asset renewal,
Well, I'm gonna need you to be full volume.
Shout it out, Elio.
the 1% asset levy. We
Can't
have-
hear.
We'll have to repeat it for you there, Corey, just a sec. Go ahead.
So the 1% asset renewal levy that has been in effect for the last 15 years has contributed roughly up to $61 million. Been used for funding the Maplewood Fire and Rescue Center. And we are looking towards debt placement of those funds over the next year.
Okay, so the comment from Elio was that we've accrued over $61 million from that source of funds. One significant project that had a big drawdown on it was the replacement of the creation of the Fire and Rescue Training Center, although that was also split with long-term debt. But that's about 60. It's only actually accumulated $61 million in the first 20 years of its collection. $1 million. Every 1% on the tax levy, well, it's a little more than that now, but it's about $1 million. And so, yeah, Ms. Chevalier.
I might be able to just add some comments on this because I deal a lot in these capital projects and I see, lots of discussions on the funding sources. So I don't have the amount with Delia for that, but I do know that these projects are funded from the infrastructure reserve, which is built up from that 1%. So all of the renewal work, and we've done, since I've been here for the last 12 years, we've really ramped up what we spend on reviewing our assets, this full asset management plan, and making sure that we're investing in sustaining those assets. When it's the like-for-like replacement, it comes from that infrastructure reserve that's funded from that levy. And then if there's a growth component, and in some projects there's both, right? Maplewood Fire, there's the like-for-like replacement, which would be from that fund. And then we tend to borrow or find other funding sources for the growth component. And so there's a lot of transparency as to which portion is funded for what, and it depends on the project.
Do we know how many projects have been funded from that fund?
I wouldn't have a number of projects with a dollar amount. I just know that we spent it on sustaining all of these assets, all of the renewal work that we see, and the work that we've shown where we've actually been tracking the condition and improving condition over time is coming from that infrastructure fund for existing assets.
Corey, can you hear any of this?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. So when a project comes up, we obviously look to the most relevant source of funds. If it's a pure replacement of a facility, then we look to these sources of funds. If it's something that's related to growth, we may go to old CAC, DCC collection or offset works collection, but it depends on the project as to whether or not it's funded from this as a source. But so far we've collected about $61 million from that source, and it's been applied to replacement of infrastructure projects in the community. Councillor Factor, does that address your concern?
Not really. You look at page 58 and you look at the expenditures, capital renewals. They are spending each year that amount. So I think Councillor Hanson has the right idea. 1% is not sufficient. It'll have to be at least 2, maybe 3 or 4% added every year.
Okay.
That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Do you want to comment?
Sure, I have a couple of thoughts that have come to me out of this. Normally, I'm just here to observe. This is what's coming in 10 years. The chickens are coming home to roost. That is pretty obvious to me as an outsider looking in. There is a deep set of expenses coming for a lot of reasons. Most of them legitimate reasons. I'm not particularly bothered by the reasons. I think there's just yet to be prepared for that. So that's just an observation because we heard this back when we were doing the last set of budget meetings. I heard this anyway. And I didn't get the details, but I heard this coming. Second point was when we're talking about distribution of distribution of growth and all the required new housing. It was intrinsically obvious to me that town centers are going to be the only way to do that cost effectively. And I know you're trying to go through all of this public input and public comment and figure out how the public wants these things to do it. If you try to put that growth as somebody described it in hinterlands, I apologize who said that. If that's what the public wants, you won't be able to afford it. We won't, forgive me, I live here, we won't be able to afford it. And then the third really stupid idea I saw in this is that every time I hear an organization that's looking to try and find a long-term funding source, the only thing I have ever heard of is an endowment. And I don't know if there are cities in the world anywhere that set up endowments and you couldn't set one up quickly that would have enough funding in it to make a difference. But if you want to set up a long-term sustainable funding source that will keep growing and keep supporting things, the only way I know of to do that for any organization of any size is an endowment. And maybe a thing to consider is starting to squirrel some income away into fund generation stuff. And it won't matter for 20 years, but at some point, maybe it would start to kick in enough that it could become a sustainable source of income. It's going to be painful getting there, and you need to spend all that money now. I know it's a problem, but that's the only thought I had looking for a long-term sustainable income source. Maybe there are others, but I don't know what they are. That's it. That's all I got.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think we've had a good discussion about this. You've covered the next steps on this as we move forward, but maybe you just rehash. Where are we actually going to go next on the next step page?
Yeah, so tonight was just a State of the Union address, effectively. Following from this, we'll be working with our finance colleagues. We'll be reporting back to the Finance and Audit Committee, probably after the summer break. And then through those discussions, as well as the information shared tonight, hopefully that will help inform any decisions that go through the fall annual budget process. So.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Thank you, everyone. We have completed the business of this evening's meeting. I'll accept adjournment. Thank you, Councillor Mary. Thank you to staff for your presentations today. We do appreciate it. Thank you, members of the public, for sticking with us, and everybody have a great evening. Good night.